Hello my friends, this is a short story and it's called Clockwork. Any similarity to any real people, as they say in the films, is purely by accident. I have nobody particularly in mind, but it is set in our nearest city. Clockwork. I may have to do this in two halves. The old clockmaker stood behind the counter of his shop in a little street near the ancient city walls and off of Shibkey Street. His eyes reflected all that he'd seen over 7.5 decades on the streets of the maiden city. His childhood had been in the hard times of the 1930s, and after all the deprivation of the Depression, he'd watched the city of his native Derry, Ireland, become strategically important in the Atlantic battles to keep ships crossing to Britain from the United States in World War II. Sadly though, his people on this side of the river had never felt they got a fair share, and unemployment among so many men spread to become a feeling of deep discontent. He'd only been okay though, because his father had given him something special, a shop and the skill to make and repair clocks. People, rich and poor, Catholic and Protestant, all needed clocks and all knew about the skill of the clockmaker. True, he had moved with the times, he'd modernised. Above his shop he had a sign that actually said, "We move with the times, buy time here." The people of Derry had been much inspired by the black folk in the USA and in South Africa. Civil rights, yes, that appealed to the clockmaker. Fair play to them, he said, because in his heart he was convinced that all men were equal. He'd reasoned on it in this way. On the Guildhall in the city of Derry there was a very large clock which could be seen from a great distance, but a man couldn't wear that on his wrist to take out to sea to go fishing or to go and work in the fields, could he? So sometimes the small was more useful than the great. People were different, but equal. The huge clock and the small watch that gave accurate time all had a role to play, and it was the same with people. To be different should not mean inequality at all, he said. So when the civil rights marches had started, he joined in with zeal, and he'd been there on that sad day when British soldiers had opened fire on unarmed protesters, the day that came to be called Bloody Sunday. And he believed it to be this day that time stopped in Derry for 30 years. Because everything that happened then was an extension of that day. His father, who had been indifferent to politics, but not to injustice, though he missed him badly, he was glad that he passed away because his internal clock stopped just a few weeks before that day. He died of a heart attack. That he'd been spared the sorrow and sadness of that awful day. The clockmaker had been troubled to see his beloved city plunge into despair, anger, and a kind of anarchy. He knew so many of those people who became the hard men of the time. Peter Delaney had been a friend, he'd been friends since primary school, and even now, way on in the 2000s, he often went with Peter to see Gaelic football matches. But those 12 years that Peter had spent in the maze, the prison camp at Longkesh, had cost Peter his marriage, made him more bitter than ever before, and the clockmaker felt that Peter was a little picture of what the Troubles did to the city, making normal people become extreme, doing things they would never have dreamed of before. In the 30 years that Derry's clock seemed to stop, nothing was normal. The clockmaker had never married. The love of his life had been Moira O'Kane. She died in an explosion in the early years of the Troubles. Even though she'd married another, he still felt responsible for her death. He never expressed it to anyone, but he did believe that you reap what you sowed. And in those initial years of violence, he had actually helped the IRA to make more accurate timing devices for their bombs. It had seemed the right thing to do after Bloody Sunday to him. It was ironic that the bomb planted on that day had an improved timer, but though much warning was given, somehow poor Moira Blake, that was her married name, had been missed, and she continued to work at her desk in the solicitor's office until the building was turned to rubble by a £500 of explosives. At her funeral, as the clockmaker shook her husband's hand and sympathised, he felt a sense of guilt that made his mood a match for that grey November afternoon. So from that day onward he vowed he would use his time to help others and to find his happiness by promoting the joy of others. So this day he walked into his workshop, lifted down the polish and his mind went back those few weeks to the day Samantha Flynn had been in his shop with her clock, and then Paul Maguire had entered with his mother's carriage clock. Perfect timing was the thought that flashed through the clockmaker's head. Samantha, a very pretty 25-year-old, caught the look in the clockmaker's eye, deep blue eyes under his white bushy eyebrows. She turned around and the embarrassment of both his customers was obvious. But the 26-year-old mechanic looked her in the eye and said, "Hello Sam, how you doing?" "I'm fine, thanks. You? What about your mother?" "She's fine. I tell you were asking about her." "Aye, I did go back to work." The clockmaker was thinking fast. "Now just hold on there, Samantha. I might have to order a part for that clock, but I might have it in the storeroom. Old Swiss clock, you say. Hang on a minute while I look." He vanished into the storeroom and closed the door behind him. He prayed that these two stubborn people would talk, and waited for 5 minutes. And when he returned they were talking. About the weather. Well, that would really help, wouldn't it? Just at that moment, Derry time reached 4 o'clock and everything was noise. He still got a schoolboy's pleasure from the cacophony of chimes, cuckoos, music box type sounds that came from the different clocks all around the shelves in his shop. And all the more so, he enjoyed it if a customer was in. But right now he was angry with the clocks. They'd gone off at the wrong moment. He told Samantha, when the noise stopped, that he would have to order a part and it would be about a week, and she gave Paul a very unfriendly look and left the shop like an icy wind. Paul sighed and placed the carriage clock on the counter. The clockmaker looked at him and sighed in return. "You don't need a clockmaker, you two need your heads examined." "There's nothing I can do." "You could try." "No point. She's made her mind up. She jumped to conclusions, and if she thinks so little of me, what can I do?" "Did you ever try explaining?" "She wouldn't listen to me. I tried." "Well, she listened to that mischief maker Sally Donald and a highly embellished version of the story. They should have a ducking stool on the bank of the Foyle for the like of her." Paul managed to laugh, but then he said, "I do love Sam, you know." "For goodness sake, tell her that." "She's misjudged me." Pride. "Most of the city thinks you didn't do any harm that night, but you're too proud to give her an explanation and she's too proud to look for one. Like the two overwound clocks over there, you sit there refusing to move on at all, both of you." "No, she's too proud to ask for a proper explanation." The clockmaker was losing patience now. "Don't you have to get back to work?" He frowned at him. "This clock will be ready by Tuesday. Tell young Jimmy next door to you to call in for it, please. That young lad loves to get in here just on the hour. Tell him to be in here for 4 o'clock on Tuesday." Tuesday at 5 minutes before 3, in came Jimmy McKee. He'd been fascinated by the clock since he was a toddler, and now he was 12 years old. The clockmaker knew that if anyone would ever take over his shop, it would be Jimmy, and he had a proposal for him. "Jimmy, you're on your holidays in a week. Do you fancy coming here in the holidays and working Thursdays and Fridays? They're my 2 busy days." Jimmy looked as if he'd been handed a bag of money. His eyes lit up and he smiled like a happy frog. Then all the clocks decided it was 3 o'clock. He waited with joy as they shouted and watched his favourite, a clock that sent a little train round a track, bang on the hour. And then the noise subsided. He said, "Aye, I'd love to." "Well, check with your dad now. Tell him I'll pay you. It's time you had a wee job. Time I shared some of the secrets of my trade with you." "But what I'm going to ask you to do now, Jimmy, is not work, it's a mission. You know, just like James Bond." Jimmy laughed. Soon he was heading off with the clock to Paul Maguire's house. He knocked the door loudly and old Mrs. Maguire, his mother, answered it. "Well, hello there, Jimmy." Jimmy, that's not my clock." Jimmy nodded and said, in a little more than a whisper, "I know, Mrs. Maguire. The clockmaker said to hold on to it and the owner will call with you in a while. He said that you must keep that person here until Paul comes home from work. He said that you and I are being like James Bond on some kind of mission." "Did he indeed?" she laughed. "What's that old scoundrel up to? Something good, no doubt. OK, Jimmy, hold on, I've a bar of chocolate here for you. I'll do as he says, but I'm a bit confused. Before Jimmy arrived at the house, Samantha arrived at the shop. With a look of great innocence, the clockmaker placed the carriage clock on the counter. Samantha, who was quite fond of the old man, tried her best to be tactful. Trying her kindest voice, she said, "That one is not my clock. Mine was a bigger wooden one, with chimes and all." She swallowed hard. "I think that one might be Paul Maguire's mother's." "Oh no, that could not be. I just sent young Jimmy up to the house with her clock." "Oh, unless I muddled them up. You two were in the shop at the same time, weren't you?" "Oh, Samantha, I'm so very sorry. Listen, if you'd kindly go and swap the clock with yours at his mother's, I wouldn't charge you for the work. It was only a small thing, and it was my mistake after all." "Oh no, I'll pay." "No need, just a few minutes' work was all it was. But what about the part you had to send for?" "I ordered 10. I've got 9 of them there in the workshop to make money for me." "But I don't want to go there." Her voice tailed off. "Samantha, I've known you since you were a newborn, right?" She nodded, and she looked down at her feet. "You and I need to talk. I need to be frank with you. Is that okay?" She nodded again. "You've hurt that woman. When you and Paul were engaged, you were never away from her house, and she treated you like she was your own mother. But since then, you were never near her." "The problem is not her." She felt trapped. "So have you told her that?" She wanted to say, "Is it any of your business?" But she just said no. Why were her eyes burning, she wondered. "Well, here's a right good opportunity." He looked at the clocks. "Paul won't be home for an hour and more. Did you plan this?" Looking her straight in the eye, he said, "What do you think I am? But time and events sometimes provide us with good circumstances." "I'd be too embarrassed." "Why?" "Because I should have been to see her before. What is no time like the present to set a right wrong, a wrong right." Samantha left the shop and felt herself being drawn as if by a magnet to the one house in Derry that she'd avoided for a long time, the house where she'd been nearly a daily visitor until Samantha rang the doorbell, knowing it rang in the kitchen where Mrs. Maguire would be at this time. Opening the door, Mrs. Maguire looked shocked. Once she had a second to think, she started to understand what the clockmaker was up to. "Samantha." When she looked at the sad face, her anger with the girl melted. "You have my clock, I say." "Yes, Mrs. Maguire." Samantha's face was bright red. I'm very..." The words froze. "Come on in, dear. I think maybe I have your clock here. It seems our friend with the clocks is losing the plot." But she knew the very opposite was the truth about him. Sam hesitated. "Come on in, love. You've always been welcome here." "Still?" "Yes, always. Come on in, please." She held out her arms, putting the carriage clock on the hall table. Samantha hugged Mary Maguire and started to cry, tears welling up from deep within her heart. "There, there." Mary hugged the girl she'd longed to have as her daughter-in-law, as if she were just a little girl. After a few minutes, she led her by the hand into the old-fashioned kitchen, the very place Paul and Samantha had decorated for her not so far back. Soon the two women were sipping tea together. Mary had baked that morning, and Samantha was pleased to be eating those fine scones again. Mary Maguire chose small talk, feeling it best not to interfere too much. Her role was to keep her in the house a little longer. She offered a silent prayer and asked, "How's your mum? How's your dad? What about your brother Mick? Did that job of his in London turn out all right? Hey, I was talking to your Aunt Annie in Austin's the other day. Hadn't seen her for months. She told me your cousin Patricia is off to Dublin to study law.